Have you ever heard of the horrific fate that befell one of Emperor Xuanzang's favorite concubines during the Tang dynasty? Her name was Lady Wang, and her tragic end remains one of history's most disturbing cases of jealousy and cruelty in the imperial courts of ancient China. What makes this story particularly chilling isn't just how she died, but who ordered it and why. The walls of the imperial palace have hidden many secrets throughout China's long history, but perhaps none quite as literal as this one: a beautiful young woman sealed alive inside a wall, left to die in darkness, while the court continued its daily routines just inches away from her living tomb. Lady Wang arrived at the imperial court in 742 CE, a delicate beauty from a minor noble family. Her exceptional talents in poetry and dance quickly caught the emperor's attention, elevating her from an ordinary concubine to one of his favorites. In a matter of months, at just 19 years old, she possessed a natural grace that made even the most accomplished court ladies seem awkward in comparison. Emperor Xuanzang, already in his 60s and growing increasingly detached from state affairs, found new joy in Lady Wang's company. Her ability to recite entire classical texts from memory impressed him, but it was her melodious laughter that truly captivated his heart. Court records describe her as having eyes like autumn pools and a voice that could make nightingales jealous. The emperor showered her with gifts: jade ornaments, silk robes woven with gold thread, and most notably, a private garden pavilion where they could escape the suffocating court protocols. What Lady Wang didn't realize was that her rapid rise had created dangerous enemies. Chief among them was Yang Guifei, the emperor's beloved consort who had dominated court life for years. Yang Guifei had come to the palace under unusual circumstances. Herself, she had been her predecessor's daughter-in-law before catching the emperor's eye. Now, approaching middle age, she maintained her influence through a powerful network of relatives placed in key government positions. Unlike Lady Wang's genuine talents, Yang Guifei's power came from political maneuvering and her family's growing control over the aging emperor. Court historians noted the stark contrast between the two women. Yang Guifei was voluptuous and commanding, while Lady Wang was slender and refined. Their personalities clashed. Just as dramatically, Yang preferred lavish displays of wealth and power, while Wang sought quiet intellectual pursuits. These differences might have remained merely a court curiosity had the emperor not begun neglecting Yang's company in favor of his new favorite. The imperial court was a place where favor could change as quickly as the direction of the wind, and everyone knew it. Courtiers who had once flocked around Yang Guifei now found reasons to compliment Lady Wang's latest poem or admire her skill with the guqin. Each compliment was noted by Yang's spies, each shift in allegiance carefully tracked. Lady Wang, naive to the dangerous game she had unwittingly entered, continued to charm the emperor with her authentic nature. She wrote a particularly moving poem about autumn leaves that brought tears to the emperor's eyes during a court recital. That night, he visited her pavilion instead of Yang's for the 7th consecutive evening. What Lady Wang didn't know was that Yang Guifei had been keeping count, and with each night she spent alone, her hatred for the younger concubine grew like a poisonous vine. Court eunuchs who saw and heard everything within the palace walls later testified that Yang had begun consulting with shamans and fortune-tellers, seeking supernatural means to eliminate her rival. The turning point came during the Mid-Autumn Festival of 743 CE, when Emperor Xuanzang announced that Lady Wang would perform her original composition at the imperial banquet. Such an honor was rarely bestowed on newcomers to the court, and it signaled her elevated status to everyone present. Lady Wang's performance was breathtaking. She played the pipa while reciting her poem about the moon goddess Change, drawing parallels between the emperor and the legendary archer Haiyuyi. The gathered ministers and nobles applauded enthusiastically, while Yang Guifei sat motionless, her face a perfect mask hiding the fury beneath. What few people noticed was how she whispered instructions to her nephew, who quietly left the celebration. By the time Lady Wang returned to her pavilion that night, flushed with success and the emperor's praise, Yang Guifei's plan was already in motion. The most disturbing aspect of what happened next is how meticulously it had been planned, suggesting that Yang had been considering this particular form of execution for some time, perhaps even before Lady Wang had arrived at court. The morning after the festival, Lady Wang was summoned to attend to the emperor. She dressed carefully in her finest silk robes, pinning her hair with the jade ornaments he had gifted her. The message had come from one of the emperor's trusted eunuchs, Li Fuguo, who was known to be loyal to Yang Guifei's faction. This should have raised suspicions, but Lady Wang was still riding the wave of her success from the previous night. The summons directed her to use a rarely traveled corridor that connected the women's quarters to the emperor's private garden, a shortcut that would allow her to avoid the prying eyes of court gossips. As she walked down the narrow passageway, fragrant with the scent of late summer flowers drifting in from the garden, she was suddenly seized by 4 strong men who had been hiding in alcoves along the path. Before she could scream, a cloth was pressed against her mouth, soaked in a sedative herb mixture that quickly rendered her unconscious. Court records are surprisingly detailed about what happened next. likely because the perpetrators were eventually forced to confess. They carried her limp body to a section of the palace that was undergoing renovations, specifically, a wall that was being rebuilt after structural damage from recent rains. The wall in question was part of an unused storage room in the eastern wing of the palace, far from both the emperor's chambers and the main court activities. The construction area had been cleared of workers that morning on Yang Guifei's orders, ostensibly to avoid disturbing the court's recovery from the previous night's festivities. In reality, it ensured no witnesses would be present. The men worked quickly, following precise instructions they'd received. First, they placed Lady Wang in a standing position within a section of the wall where two wooden support beams created a narrow cavity. Her arms were pulled behind these beams and bound tightly, forcing her body into an upright position, even in unconsciousness. This particular detail reveals the truly horrifying nature of Yang Guifei's revenge. Lady Wang would not simply be killed. She would die slowly, unable to move, watching as her tomb was sealed around her. The men then began mixing fresh mortar, preparing to close the cavity with new bricks. As they worked, Lady Wang began to stir, the effects of the sedative wearing off more quickly than anticipated. The leader of the group, later identified as Yang Guifei's cousin, made a quick decision to gag her before she could fully regain consciousness and scream for help. By the time Lady Wang's eyes fluttered open, the wall had already been sealed to her waist. Imagine the horror of regaining consciousness to find yourself partially entombed, unable to move or cry out, watching as each new brick further sealed your fate. According to the confessions, her eyes widened in terror as she realized what was happening. And despite the gag, her muffled screams could be heard by her murderers. Tears streamed down her face as the wall rose higher, eventually reaching her shoulders. One of the men, overcome with guilt, later reported that he couldn't bear to look at her eyes during those final moments and focused, instead, on laying the bricks as quickly as possible. The final bricks were placed to cover her face, with small gaps intentionally left to ensure she would not die quickly from suffocation. This calculated cruelty was the most chilling aspect of Yang Guifei's plan. Lady Wang would die slowly from dehydration and starvation, a process that could take days. Once the wall was complete, the men smoothed the mortar and applied a fresh coat of whitewash, leaving no external sign of the horror concealed within. They collected their tools and left, instructed to resume normal duties as if nothing had happened. The disappearance of Lady Wang was noticed almost immediately. When she failed to appear at the afternoon court session, Emperor Xuanzong became concerned and sent servants to check her quarters. Finding them empty, with her prized possessions still in place, a search of the palace grounds was ordered. Yang Guifei expressed appropriate concern, even suggesting that imperial guards be sent to search the city in case Lady Wang had fled the palace for some unknown reason. For 2 days, the search continued, while Lady Wang remained trapped inside the wall, still alive and suffering an unimaginable death. Had the plan gone perfectly, her body might never have been discovered, becoming one of the many unsolved mysteries of the imperial court. But Yang Guifei's perfect crime was undone by something. She couldn't have anticipated the summer heat and the natural processes of decomposition. On the 3rd day, after Lady Wang's disappearance, servants reported a strange odor coming from the eastern storage rooms, initially dismissed as dead rodents or spoiled goods. The smell grew stronger as the days passed, eventually becoming impossible to ignore. When workers were finally sent to investigate, they noticed a discolored section of a recently repaired wall, with a dark liquid seeping through the whitewash. The discovery of Lady Wang's body sent shockwaves through the imperial court. Emperor Xuanzong, devastated by the gruesome murder of his favorite, ordered an immediate investigation. Under intense interrogation, the 4 men responsible broke down and confessed, implicating Yang Guifei as the mastermind behind the plot. Historical records describe the emperor's rage upon learning the truth. He collapsed upon seeing Lady Wang's body, still bound and preserved in the cavity of the wall, her face frozen in an expression of terror and suffering. Court physicians estimated that she had survived for at least 2 days inside the wall before succumbing to dehydration. What made the discovery even more heartbreaking was the evidence that she had struggled desperately to free herself. Her wrists were raw and bloodied from pulling against her bonds, and her fingernails had broken off as she tried to scratch at the mortar surrounding her. Some historical accounts claim that when her body was removed, a small jade hairpin was found clutched in her hand, with scratches on the wall suggesting she had tried to carve a message, or perhaps simply marked the passing time during her final hours. The emperor ordered that Lady Wang be given a proper burial with full honors, an unprecedented gesture for a concubine. The question of punishment for this horrific crime became the central drama of the imperial court in the weeks that followed. Yang Guifei, who had initially denied any involvement, found herself isolated as her co-conspirators gave detailed testimonies of her instructions. Her powerful family, sensing the shift in the emperor's favor, began distancing themselves from her. more concerned with preserving their positions than protecting her. Emperor Xuanzang faced a difficult decision. Yang Guifei had been his beloved consort for many years, and her family had become deeply embedded in the imperial government. Executing her would not only mean losing someone he had once loved deeply, but could potentially destabilize the entire administration. Historical records show that he secluded himself for days, refusing food and company as he wrestled with his decision. Court officials, many of whom had resented Yang Guifei's influence, pressed for severe punishment, arguing that such a crime could not go unpunished regardless of the perpetrator's status. The common people, who had learned of the gruesome murder through palace gossip, gathered outside the imperial city, their angry murmurs growing louder each day. The emperor's decision, when it finally came, reflected both his personal anguish and political pragmatism. Yang Guifei would be stripped of her titles and confined to a remote palace far from the capital, effectively exiled but spared execution. Her family members directly involved in the plot were not so fortunate. Her cousin, who had led the murder team, was publicly executed. Along with the 3 other men who had built the wall, several of her relatives were removed from government positions, their property confiscated by the imperial treasury. The punishment satisfied neither those who had called for Yang Guifei's execution nor her remaining supporters who had hoped for clemency. It did, however, allow the emperor to demonstrate justice while avoiding the political chaos that might have resulted from executing the powerful consort. Court historians noted that Emperor Xuanzang never fully recovered from the trauma of Lady Wang's murder. He became withdrawn and increasingly paranoid, suspecting plots against his favorites. The once vibrant court atmosphere, known for its artistic and intellectual pursuits, turned somber and tense. Some historians argue that this event marked the beginning of the emperor's decline, which would eventually contribute to the An Lushan rebellion that nearly toppled the Tang dynasty several years later. The story of Lady Wang might have faded into obscurity, one tragedy among many in China's long imperial history, if not for what happened during the palace renovations nearly a century later. Workers demolishing the old eastern wing made a discovery that brought her story back to public attention. Inside another wall, not far from where Lady Wang had been entombed, they found the remains of 3 more women. Forensic examination, primitive by modern standards but detailed in court records, suggested these women had also been sealed inside the wall while still alive. The positioning of their remains indicated they had been bound in the same manner as Lady Wang, and fragments of fine silk clothing suggested they had been court ladies of some status. More disturbing was the evidence that these deaths had occurred years before Lady Wang's murder, indicating that Yang Guifei had not invented this method of execution but had perhaps learned of it from earlier court intrigues. This revelation transformed understanding of Lady Wang's case. What had seemed like an isolated act of jealousy now appeared to be part of a darker pattern within the imperial court. Historians began questioning how many other bodies might be hidden within the palace walls, victims of power struggles and jealousies that had never been recorded. These discoveries sparked a more thorough investigation of the palace structure, resulting in the identification of at least 7 more sites where human remains were found within walls or beneath floors. The victims spanned several decades, suggesting that this method of disposing of rivals had become something of a tradition among the most powerful women of the court. Emperor Dizong, who ruled during these renovations, was reportedly so disturbed by the findings that he ordered a complete historical account to be compiled, detailing each case that could be verified. This document, known as the Record of Hidden Sorrows, became an important historical source, though only fragments survive today. What makes these accounts particularly valuable to historians is how they illuminate the often overlooked power dynamics among imperial women. While official histories focused on emperors and male officials, these grisly discoveries provided evidence of the shadow court, the complex and deadly serious competition among women for influence and survival, in a system that gave them few legitimate paths to power. The cases revealed how concubines and consorts developed their own systems of alliance, espionage, and elimination when direct confrontation was impossible due to their subordinate status. The wall death method revealed something particularly disturbing about imperial court culture: its capacity to normalize extreme cruelty when deployed against those who violated its unwritten rules. Court records show surprisingly little moral outrage about the method itself, focusing instead on whether particular victims had deserved their fate based on their perceived transgressions. This normalization of cruelty reflects the deeply hierarchical nature of imperial society, where human life was valued according to rank and connection rather than any inherent worth. Modern historians have noted that the victims were almost exclusively women who had risen quickly from lower status positions, suggesting that these killings served partially as enforcement of the social order. Those born to privilege could accept newcomers who knew their place, but ambitious women who threatened to disrupt the established hierarchy became targets. The physical nature of the punishment, literally embedding the victim within the structure of the palace, has been interpreted as a symbolic reinforcement of boundaries. The message was clear: Attempt to rise too high, too quickly, and you would be forcibly returned to your proper place invisible, silenced, and serving only as structural support for the system that consumed you. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Lady Wang's story, and the similar cases discovered later, is how they reveal the psychological warfare practiced within the imperial harem. Concubines lived in close proximity, competing for limited imperial attention and favor. They would have been acutely aware of the fates of their predecessors, walking daily past the very walls that concealed their remains. Imagine the impact of knowing that the woman who had previously occupied your pavilion now resided within its walls, or that your rival's sudden departure to her homeland had actually ended just a few feet away, behind a fresh coat of plaster. Some historical accounts suggest that older court women would sometimes hint at these hidden deaths when counseling new arrivals, using them as veiled threats to ensure compliance with established hierarchies. "The palace walls have ears" was a common saying, but for those who understood the full implications, it carried a much more sinister meaning. The walls didn't just hear, they consumed. This psychological dimension transformed the physical space of the palace from merely opulent to actively menacing, with every wall potentially concealing both secrets and bodies. The discovery of these multiple victims changed how historians understood power in the imperial court, particularly among women. Traditional historical accounts had often portrayed imperial concubines as passive players in male-dominated power struggles, but these findings suggested a far more complex reality. The women of the imperial court had developed their own parallel power structures, complete with methods of enforcement that could be implemented without male approval or even awareness. Yang Guifei's orchestration of Lady Wang's murder demonstrated sophisticated network management. She had loyal operatives among the eunuchs, construction workers, and her own family members, all coordinated to act quickly when the opportunity arose. What's particularly notable is how this parallel female power system operated largely invisible to the official male hierarchy. Emperor Xuanzang, despite his absolute authority on paper, had no idea that multiple women had been executed within his own palace using the same method that would later claim Lady Wang. This suggests a significant blind spot in imperial governance. While meticulously monitoring official channels of power, emperors often remained unaware of the deadly serious games being played by the women closest to them. Some historians have argued that understanding these female power networks is essential to comprehending how dynasties functioned and ultimately why some failed. The story of Lady Wang and the other Hua victims offers a glimpse into the complex relationship between architecture and power in imperial China. Palace design wasn't merely aesthetic, it was a sophisticated system for controlling access, visibility, and movement. The women's quarters were specifically designed to both display and conceal their occupants, according to strict protocols. The narrow corridors where Lady Wang was ambushed existed because imperial architects needed to balance contradictory requirements, allowing service access while maintaining the seclusion of imperial women. These architectural features created natural opportunities for the kind of ambush that claimed Lady Wang's life. Similarly, the constant renovation of palace buildings provided convenient opportunities for concealing bodies within new construction. The palace was, in many ways, designed to facilitate secrecy and hidden violence, with its maze-like layout of courtyards, screens, and interconnected buildings creating countless private spaces where power could be exercised away from official oversight. Modern archaeological work at surviving palace sites has confirmed these features, identifying specific locations where surveillance was possible or where activities could be conducted in complete privacy. The architecture itself became both weapon and accomplice in the deadly politics of the inner court. After the extensive discoveries during Emperor Dezong's reign, imperial authorities implemented new construction protocols specifically designed to prevent bodies from being hidden within palace structures. Walls were to be built with multiple witnesses present, materials were to be inspected before use, and completed work was subject to random examinations before being sealed or plastered. These practical measures acknowledge how thoroughly the wall death method had become integrated into court politics. Architectural records from this period show the first instances of what might be called anti-concealment features was built with irregular cavities that would make hiding a body immediately obvious, or with specific patterns of materials that would be difficult to replicate if disturbed. Some sections of the palace were rebuilt with thinner walls that couldn't accommodate a human body. Despite the structural compromises this entailed, court women were forbidden from interfering with construction projects or giving orders to workers without male oversight. These reforms reflect an interesting intersection of architecture, governance, and gender politics. The physical structure of the palace was redesigned specifically to limit the exercise of female power, returning spatial control firmly to the male hierarchy. Whether these measures were entirely successful remains unclear, but the detailed nature of the regulations suggests how seriously authorities took the threat. The story of Lady Wang left a lasting impact on Chinese culture, evolving from historical account to ghost story over the centuries. Folktales emerged about her spirit haunting the imperial palace. Her muffled cries heard emanating from walls on quiet nights. These stories transformed her from a victim to a supernatural avenger, claiming that any woman who plotted against her rivals would eventually find herself visited by Lady Wang's ghost, which would drag her into the nearest wall. During the song, Dynasty, several centuries after her death, a popular opera titled The Walled Beauty dramatized her story, though with significant artistic liberties. In this version, Lady Wang becomes a heroic figure who intentionally provokes Yang Guifei's jealousy after discovering her plot against the emperor. Her entombment is portrayed as a noble sacrifice that eventually exposes the conspiracy. What's fascinating about these cultural adaptations is how they reclaimed agency for a woman who had been utterly deprived of it in her final moments. Unable to accept the horrific powerlessness of her actual death, cultural memory transformed Lady Wang into someone who chose her fate for a greater purpose. This pattern of reimagining female victims as agents of their own destiny appears frequently in Chinese folklore, perhaps reflecting a collective need to find meaning in such disturbing examples of cruelty. Archaeological evidence has provided physical confirmation of the practice described in historical texts. During renovations of Tang Dynasty palace ruins in the 1950s, human remains were indeed discovered within wall cavities, with positioning consistent with the descriptions in The Record of Hidden Sorrows. Modern forensic analysis confirmed that at least some of these individuals had been placed in the walls while still alive, based on evidence of desperate struggles and attempts to free themselves. These findings sparked renewed scholarly interest in the politics of the imperial harem and led to more nuanced historical analyses of women's roles in court politics. Perhaps most significantly, these discoveries challenged the romanticized portrayal of imperial life that had dominated both scholarly and popular understanding. The glittering court culture celebrated in poetry and art existed alongside and was partially enabled by systems of extreme cruelty and control. For every talented concubine like Lady Wang who briefly captured an emperor's admiration through artistic accomplishments, countless others lived in fear, navigating deadly politics, where the penalty for missteps could be literally becoming part of the palace structure. This juxtaposition of cultural refinement and brutal enforcement characterized not just the imperial harem but many aspects of court society, where exquisite poetry might be composed by the same hands that ordered horrific punishments. The practice of wall entombment reveals something particularly disturbing about power dynamics in the imperial court. The preference for punishments that erased not just the victim's life but their very existence from visible society. Unlike public executions, which acknowledged the condemned person and their crimes, wall deaths were designed to make people disappear without trace. The victims would not receive proper burial rites, their spirits were believed to remain trapped and unsettled, and their families often never learned their true fate. This complete erasure represented the ultimate exercise of power, the ability to remove someone so thoroughly that they became literally part of the background, their suffering silenced behind layers of brick and plaster. Historians have noted the psychological sophistication of this approach to elimination. While public execution might create martyrs or spark sympathy, disappearance generated uncertainty and fear. Did the missing concubine flee, receive a distant posting, or now reside within the very walls? This uncertainty served as a powerful control mechanism, with the palace architecture itself becoming a constant, silent reminder of the consequences of defiance. The walls didn't just contain the women physically, they contained them psychologically through the omnipresent threat of absorption into the structure itself. Emperor Xuanzang's handling of Lady Wang's murder and its aftermath has been debated by historians for centuries. His decision to spare Yang Guifei from execution while punishing her accomplices appears contradictory to modern observers. Either she was guilty and deserved the same fate as the others, or she was innocent and her family was unjustly punished. However, this seemingly inconsistent response reflects the complex reality of imperial governance, where justice was always balanced against political necessity. Yang Guifei's extensive family connections made her too dangerous to execute but too guilty to pardon completely. The emperor's compromise solution, exile, without official disgrace, attempted to satisfy competing demands for justice and stability. Some historians view this episode as evidence of Xuanzang's declining judgment and authority, pointing out that a stronger ruler would have either protected his consort completely or punished her appropriately, regardless of consequences. Others see it as a sophisticated political maneuver that prevented immediate crisis while gradually dismantling Yang Guifei's power base. What's clear is that the emperor never fully resolved his conflicted feelings. Historical records note that he ordered a small memorial shrine built for Lady Wang but continued to send gifts and messages to Yang Guifei in her exile, suggesting a man torn between justice and lingering attachment, unable to commit fully to either. The Lady Wang incident had broader implications for the Tang dynasty than might be expected from what was essentially a domestic murder, coming at a time when Emperor Xuanzang was increasingly withdrawing from active governance. It accelerated the power shift from the throne to various court factions. The partial disgrace of the Yang family created a temporary power vacuum that was quickly filled by competing groups, leading to increasing instability in court politics. More significantly, the public nature of the scandal, with details spreading quickly through the capital, despite official attempts at discretion, damaged the moral authority of the throne. Common people began questioning an emperor who could neither protect his favorites nor properly punish their murderers. This erosion of imperial prestige contributed to the general weakening of central authority that would eventually lead to the catastrophic Anlishan Rebellion just a decade later. Some historians go so far as to draw a direct line from Lady Wang's entombment to the near collapse of the dynasty, arguing that the emperor's compromised response revealed fundamental weaknesses in the imperial system that ambitious generals like an Aleutian would soon exploit. While this may overstate the case, it's clear that seemingly private palace dramas could have far-reaching consequences when they exposed contradictions in how power was exercised at the highest levels. The archaeological evidence of multiple wall entombments raises disturbing questions about how widespread this practice might have been across China's long imperial history. While the Tang dynasty cases are well documented due to the fortunate preservation of records and physical evidence, similar methods may have been employed in other dynasties where documentation has been lost. Some historians have suggested that the practice represents an extreme example of the living burial concept that appears in various forms throughout Chinese history. Servants and concubines were sometimes buried with emperors and nobles, though this practice was officially discontinued early in imperial history, and certain religious traditions included voluntary self-immurement among devotees seeking spiritual transcendence. What distinguishes the wall deaths is their use as covert executions, not ceremonial, not voluntary, but hidden acts of elimination designed to remove rivals while maintaining plausible deniability. The fact that multiple cases have been documented suggests that knowledge of the technique was passed down through generations of courtwomen and their servants, forming part of the unofficial curriculum for survival in the imperial harem. This transmission of deadly knowledge represents a dark counterpart to the more celebrated traditions of poetry, music, and art that were officially taught to palace women. The discovery of Lady Wang's fate changed how Emperor Xuanzong was viewed by history, previously celebrated as a ruler who presided over one of China's most culturally brilliant eras. His inability to protect her or deliver appropriate justice tarnished his legacy. Court historians, writing shortly after these events, began portraying him as a ruler whose judgment had been compromised by personal attachments, allowing powerful families like the Yangs to manipulate imperial authority for their own purposes. This reassessment extended beyond the emperor to the entire court culture of the mid-Tang period. What had once been viewed as a golden age of arts and refinement was increasingly interpreted as a decadent era, where aesthetic achievements masked moral corruption. Lady Wang herself became a symbolic figure in historical narratives, the talented, innocent newcomer destroyed by entrenched power, representing the vulnerability of merit in a system dominated by connection and intrigue. Her death came to exemplify how the Tang court, for all its cultural sophistication, had developed equally sophisticated methods of cruelty. This historical reframing demonstrates how seemingly isolated incidents can shift understanding of entire eras when they expose underlying patterns of governance and power that official histories might otherwise obscure. The Hua death method reveals something particularly significant about gender and power in imperial China, how women denied official authority developed alternative systems of control and elimination. Unable to command armies or issue official edicts, powerful consorts like Yang Gaifei created parallel structures of power that operated through networks of loyal servants, family members, and court allies. These networks could implement complex operations like Lady Wang's murder without requiring official approval or resources. What's particularly notable is how these female-centered power networks exploited blind spots in the male-dominated official system. Palace architecture, designed by men primarily to control women's visibility and movement, was repurposed by those same women as a tool for eliminating rivals. Construction projects, overseen by male officials but implemented by workers who could be bribed or threatened, provided perfect opportunities for concealing evidence. Even the emperor's own routine, his predictable visits to different consorts, his scheduled court appearances was incorporated into the planning of these operations. This sophisticated adaptation to constraint demonstrates how power always finds expression, even when formally denied. The women of the imperial court, officially powerless, developed methods of exercising deadly authority that exploited the very systems designed to contain them. Modern archaeological techniques have provided new insights into the physical experience of victims like Lady Wang. Ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation of palace sites have revealed the exact dimensions of wall cavities where remains were found, allowing forensic specialists to reconstruct the positioning of victims. These analyses confirm the historical accounts victims were indeed placed in standing positions, bound to structural supports within the walls. with small air spaces intentionally preserved to prolong their suffering. Bone analysis shows evidence of desperate struggles, with wrist and ankle fractures consistent with someone pulling against restraints with maximum force. Perhaps most disturbing are the scratch marks preserved in ancient plaster, showing how victims tried to claw their way out as the walls were completed around them. These physical traces transform Lady Wang and others like her from historical abstractions to viscerally real individuals whose final moments can be reconstructed in harrowing detail. Archaeological evidence also confirms another aspect of historical accounts, the careful planning evident in these murders. Wall cavities were precisely sized for their victims, binding points aligned with structural elements, and airspaces calculated to extend suffering without risking discovery through noise. This physical evidence of premeditation challenges any interpretation of these deaths as impulsive crimes of passion, instead revealing them as meticulously planned executions carried out with technical precision. The story of Lady Wang and similar victims offers insight into how imperial concubines were simultaneously valued and devalued in Chinese court society. On one hand, talented women like Lady Wang could rise rapidly based on their artistic abilities and personal charm, suggesting a meritocratic element to the system. On the other hand, the ease with which they could be eliminated once they fell from favor reveals how tenuous their position remained, regardless of imperial favor. This contradiction stemmed from their fundamental status as human property, valuable possessions who could enhance an emperor's enjoyment and prestige, but never truly independent persons with inherent rights. Historical records often describe concubines using the same language applied to precious objects. They were acquired, presented, displayed, and eventually disposed of when no longer desired. This objectification reached its logical extreme in the Hua deaths, where women literally became incorporated into the palace structure, transformed from decorative living assets to hidden structural elements. Some feminist historians have interpreted these cases as the ultimate expression of the concubine's paradoxical status, valued for bringing beauty and culture into the palace, while simultaneously treated as expendable materials whose bodies could be repurposed as building components when their primary function ended. The relationship between Lady Wang's murder and the broader pattern of Hua deaths discovered later raises important questions about innovation versus tradition in court violence. Did Yang Guifei invent this particular method of elimination, or was she drawing on established precedent? Historical evidence suggests something in between, while earlier cases confirm she didn't create the technique. The specific implementation, in Lady Wang's case, shows refinements that indicate planning based on lessons from previous incidents. The positioning of the body to prolong suffering, the careful calculation of airspace, and the selection of a wall scheduled for whitewashing to hide any seepage all suggest an evolved methodology rather than a spontaneous decision. This pattern of refinement in cruelty reflects something disturbing about institutional violence, how methods of harm tend to be preserved and improved upon rather than abandoned, particularly when they prove effective at achieving desired outcomes with minimal risk to perpetrators. Each successful concealment taught lessons that were incorporated into future incidents, creating an unofficial but highly developed tradition of specialized execution. The preservation and transmission of this knowledge represents a dark counterpart to the cultural traditions more commonly associated with imperial courts, suggesting that techniques of elimination were cultivated alongside arts like calligraphy and music. Perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of Lady Wang's story is Emperor Xuanzang's response to her murder. Historical records describe his initial grief as overwhelming. He wept openly, ordered an unprecedented formal funeral for a concubine, and demanded immediate investigation. Yet his eventual decision to spare Yang Guifei from execution suggests either lingering attachment that overrode his sense of justice or a pragmatic calculation about political stability that took precedence over personal feelings. Contemporary court observers noted a profound change in his personality. After these events, he became hesitant in decision-making, suspicious of those around him, and increasingly reliant on divinatory practices when facing choices. Some historians have interpreted these changes as symptoms of what modern psychology would identify as trauma. The emperor experienced not just grief over Lady Wang's death, but a fundamental shattering of his understanding of his own court. The discovery that such extreme violence could occur, literally within the walls of his palace, orchestrated by a woman he had loved for years, destroyed his sense of control and safety in his most intimate environment. This psychological destabilization contributed to his growing detachment from governance, creating a leadership vacuum that would eventually be filled by the very forces that would nearly destroy the dynasty. The wall deaths represent an extreme example of how architecture can be weaponized, turning living spaces into instruments of execution. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is how they inverted the normal relationship between buildings and occupants. Architecture is typically designed to serve human needs, providing shelter, facilitating desired activities, expressing status and values. In these murders, humans instead became subordinated to the building, literally incorporated into its structure. This perversion of the human-architecture relationship has made Lady Wang's story particularly resonant with historians of built environments, who note how it exemplifies architecture's potential as an instrument of power and control. The palace walls served multiple functions simultaneously. They displayed imperial wealth through their fine construction, controlled movement and access through their arrangement, concealed private activities from public view, and ultimately, provided a method for eliminating unwanted persons while hiding evidence of their fate. This multi-layered functionality demonstrates how thoroughly power relations can be embedded in physical structures, often in ways not immediately visible but profoundly consequential for those who live within them. Modern architectural theorists have drawn parallels between these imperial practices and contemporary concerns about surveillance architecture, noting how buildings continue to serve as instruments of control, albeit in less overtly violent forms. The Hua deaths also provide insight into the complex religious and spiritual beliefs surrounding death in imperial China. Proper burial with appropriate rituals was considered essential for transitioning the spirit to the afterlife and ensuring it didn't become a dangerous wandering ghost. By denying victims these rituals and proper tomb spaces, the perpetrators were inflicting what was believed to be a spiritual punishment extending beyond physical death. Court women would have been acutely aware of these implications, making the threat of wall entombment even more terrifying. It promised not just a painful death, but eternal spiritual unrest. This spiritual dimension helps explain why ghost stories about Lady Wang and other wall victims emerged so quickly and persistently. The living needed to make sense of deaths that violated proper order, creating narratives where these wronged spirits found justice or purpose despite their improper disposal. These ghost stories served multiple cultural functions. They restored agency to the victims, provided cautionary tales about court intrigue, and established a spiritual consequence for those who committed such murders. The belief that Lady Wang's spirit could drag new perpetrators into walls created a supernatural deterrent in a system where official justice might fail to punish powerful offenders. These spiritual beliefs thus created an additional regulatory system operating alongside official laws and punishments, using supernatural consequences to discourage behaviors that human authority might be unable or unwilling to control. The wall death method represents a particularly gendered form of violence in imperial China. While male criminals and political enemies certainly faced brutal executions, their punishments were typically public, acknowledged in official records, and performed with specific ritual elements that recognized their humanity even while ending their lives. The wall deaths, by contrast, were designed to make women disappear, completely unacknowledged, unrecorded, and literally absorbed into the background structure of the palace. This difference reflects the distinct power dynamics facing men and women in imperial society. Men who violated rules were punished as subjects who had defied authority but were still recognized as political beings worthy of formal process. Women who disrupted hierarchies or threatened established powers were eliminated as objects that had malfunctioned or become inconvenient, requiring disposal rather than formal punishment. This fundamental difference in how transgression was conceptualized and addressed reveals the deeper gender asymmetry underlying imperial governance. While both men and women could face death for challenging authority, only women faced the additional erasure of being literally built into walls removed, not just from life but from historical memory and spiritual rest. This gendered difference in how bodies were treated after death reflects and reinforces the profound inequality in how they were valued during life. The discovery of multiple wall victims during later renovations transformed understanding of Tang Dynasty court politics in ways that continue to influence historical interpretation. Traditional histories had portrayed the imperial court as a hierarchical but essentially irreverent environment where even the most serious conflicts played out through established channels of influence and authority. The wall deaths revealed a shadow reality where lethal violence could be deployed covertly by court women operating outside official power structures. This discovery challenged conventional understanding of how imperial authority functioned and who could exercise deadly power within the palace system. It revealed that, alongside the visible male-dominated hierarchies documented in official histories, existed parallel female networks, capable of implementing sophisticated operations without imperial knowledge or sanction. Modern historians have used these cases to develop more nuanced models of court power that acknowledge multiple, sometimes competing systems of authority operating simultaneously within the imperial structure, rather than seeing power as flowing purely from the emperor downward through official ranks. Contemporary scholarship recognizes the complex web of relationships, loyalties, and hidden authorities that characterized imperial governance in practice. Lady Wang's death thus continues to influence how we understand historical power dynamics, reminding us that official records capture only part of the story and that some of the most consequential actions occur literally behind walls, hidden from both contemporary observers and future historians. The long-term psychological impact on palace women who lived and worked where these murders occurred must have been profound. Imagine serving in chambers where you knew previous occupants had been sealed into the very walls surrounding you, or walking daily past the exact spot where a predecessor had been entombed, alive. This knowledge would transform the palace from a space of luxury and opportunity into one of constant menace, where architectural features took on sinister second meanings. Records from later Tang court women include subtle references to this atmosphere of fear, poems about walls that seemed to breathe, diaries mentioning precautions like never walking alone through certain corridors, and requests for quarters in newer sections of the palace where renovations had not yet occurred. This environmental anxiety represents an often overlooked aspect of court life, how knowledge of past violence inhabits spaces and shapes behavior within them. Modern psychological research on environmental triggers suggests that living in spaces associated with known traumas creates chronic stress responses even in individuals who weren't directly victimized. For court women already navigating complex political dangers, this additional psychological burden must have been significant, influencing everything from sleep patterns to social alliances to daily movement through the palace. The walls that physically contained these women also contained them, psychologically through the implicit threat embedded in their knowledge of what those walls might conceal.